All right, so hi everyone and welcome to today's seminar, our sessions in women's leadership in global health, here with the Johns Hopkins Center for Global Health. As we get started, especially since we've been taking this 1 month break in this series, I'll just take some time to remind us all of the house rules for those of you who are new or returning. In addition to learning from our speaker and the Q&A session today, we really view this Zoom session as a networking space. So please do feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, share your LinkedIn profile, and get to know others here today. But make sure you select all panelists and all attendees when you do this, otherwise you are just networking with me and Megan and Fatima. If you think this will be distracting to you though, some people don't like to do that, you can close off the chat and you don't have to look at it and just focus on the seminar session. We also have a Slack networking group that you're all invited to join, and my colleague Megan will add the link to the chat in just a moment for how to join that Slack network. This space, you can use it to talk to members of the network more broadly, to raise specific issues related to women's leadership into global health, to share experience, or to connect specifically with certain individuals. And we have over 550 members. So if you would like to join that Slack network, you can do so, and Megan will make sure that link gets in the chat for you. As we go through today's seminar session, please make sure that you use the Q&A function to ask any questions, not the chat, since that's usually pretty busy with people having side conversations. So just make sure you throw that Q&A in that Q&A function specifically. And again, in the chat, please make sure if you introduce yourself and you want to connect that you select all panelists and attendees, not just all panelists. So I think I've covered the major house rules and we can get started. Our speaker today is Fatima Hassan. She is a South African human rights lawyer and a social justice activist. She's the founder and head of the newly established Health Justice Initiative in South Africa, and is also the former executive director of the Open Society Foundation for South Africa. She's dedicated her personal life to defending and promoting human rights in South Africa, particularly related to HIV and AIDS, where she worked for the AIDS Law Project and acted for the Treatment Action Campaign in many of its legal cases. She has a BA and LLB from the University of Witwatersrand and a LLM from Duke University. And we're so excited to have you with us today. Fatima, over to you. Oh, can't hear you.
Sorry, muted. I think that has to be the word of 2020 and 2021, right? Unmute yourself. So, and I suppose it's symbolic as well, because it's what we tell women in the space all the time. So, you know, just really wonderful to be on this with Anna and, you know, all of the participants, and many of you are MPH students. It's just really such a pleasure to meet all of you, because you really are the future for the demand, I think, to ensure that the people who are the most vulnerable in the world, particularly people in the global south, can access health services, and in so doing access health justice. So I've been asked to basically speak a bit about myself and my own journey, and I think that's one of the challenges, right? When you a woman in a position of leadership, that you never ever want to do that, because I think you just basically conditioned to not speak about yourself or without reference to a community, and I'll come to why that matters shortly. So I grew up in apartheid South Africa, and one of the reasons why I focus on issues around social justice and particularly health justice is because I grew up with inequality. I grew up with a race inequality, with a gender inequality, and in a society that was extremely patriarchal. And as the patriarchy basically worsened, it became a misogynist society. And I think also part of the spaces that I was in also became quite, or there were high levels of misogyny. So one of the things about people, if you know people from South Africa, is if you grew up under apartheid and if you grew up in the struggle against apartheid, social injustice is one of the things that are sort of the greatest triggers, right, about why we do the work that we do. And so my journey to basically becoming, the director of the Open Society Foundation for South Africa, or becoming the special advisor to the Minister of Health in South Africa after a deadly period of HIV/AIDS denialism, was one where women in my community were not expected to study, were not expected to complete tertiary education, were not encouraged to do that. And so from an early stage, I believe that myself and my colleagues and my friends or people in my particular circle had to address issues of patriarchy in relation to access to educational opportunity. And so the struggle just to get a degree or just to get a qualification was even more pronounced in some of my male counterparts or people who were men in my community, because it was just not something that was regarded as positive for women to be able to not just pursue 1 degree or 2 degrees, but even 3 degrees, let alone going into the field of social justice or human rights law. It was almost assumed that if you are going to do that, you should go into the corporate sector or you should go into the academic sector and not necessarily fight for rights or fight for human rights. And, my entire engagement with the work that I did in HIV/AIDS was by accident. And so basically I graduated from law school, I had finished my articles of clerkship, and had, some of the most amazing mentors who have always been women in my life. And we'll come to the relevance and importance of mentorship throughout your entire career. And basically I wanted to go on a holiday. And in order to fund my own holiday, which was basically the first time that I was going to travel overseas, I needed a job, basically, before I was going to join a private law firm or a corporate law firm in South Africa. And I was introduced to a friend who was working at an NGO who needed somebody to help out for a few months. So I knew nothing about HIV/AIDS. I had never met a single person living with HIV in my very sheltered sort of, life growing up in a one-race community, because the way in which apartheid worked was my family was considered Indian because we were brown, even though we were 3rd or 4th generation South African, and we lived separate lives from people who were regarded as white, people who were regarded as Black African, and people who were regarded as colored. So when I talk about a sheltered, unequal life, that's basically what I'm talking about. And I mean, a lot has been written about the impact of apartheid on all of our abilities to live a full productive life and to have the greatest educational opportunities. So it was doubly difficult as a person who was considered non-white to be able to access a tertiary education. But be that as it may, the need to actually go on a holiday was the reason why I got introduced to HIV/AIDS. And what started out as a 3-month temporary job at the AIDS Law Project, which is based at the University of Witwatersrand, which was founded actually by Justice Edwin Cameron, who later became one of the first openly gay judges of the highest court in South Africa. That led to me taking up the job at the AIDS Law Project. At a time, basically 1996, when South Africa had just entered its democracy and was negotiating its new constitution. And we'll come to the relevance of the constitution later. So what started out as a 3-month holiday job basically lasted into a 10-year journey of working with some of the most amazing activists and health experts and legal experts on issues related to civil and political rights, but also socio-economic rights on HIV and AIDS. And in particular, working on access to medicines within that particular field. So, if you had asked a younger Fatima when I was 12 years old, if I would see myself at 26, 27, working on the rights of people living with HIV to access ARVs, I probably would have told you that is so far-fetched, that is not going to happen, because the reason why you study law is to do, a particular set of work, right? Nobody ever thought that you would be able to use law as a tool to advance the right to access to healthcare services, and in particular, the right to access ARVs. And that 10-year period was characterized by a few things. And it's what I want to talk about in relation to misogyny. The way in which I experienced misogyny in this particular legal and health field was both internally as well as externally. So the external misogyny is one where you have government officials, you have the president, you have decision makers who are all men who do not appreciate or understand both the input and the insight of women health leaders, of women lawyers, of women judges. At the time at which I was working at the AIDS Law Project, when the Constitutional Court was being set up, the first Constitutional Court had 9 men on the court and only 2 women. One of those women later turned out to be one of my key mentors, and is somebody who I also clerked for at the Constitutional Court, and her name is Justice Kate O'Regan. But the internal misogyny of the health movement is something, you know, we also obviously have to acknowledge and understand, because you're basically operating in a post-apartheid environment, in a new constitutional democracy, but where women are still not regarded as valuable or important, or their mind or their knowledge is not regarded with the same sort of premium as you would sort of male activists or male leaders in the civil society space. And so from the beginning, you're in this contested space, and at times it becomes adversarial, because you're always trying to do 2 things. One, to prove your worth, that you belong in that particular space and you belong in the global access to healthcare or access to medicine space. But 2, that what you are saying is actually rooted in evidence, is based on proper facts and information, and that it is, if not more valuable, at least equally valuable to what your male counterparts are saying, right? And so from the beginning, you basically engage in a battle to try and prove that your contribution matters. And if I can, you know, go back in time, what I would tell my younger self is, you've got to find a way of cutting out the noise, right? And you've got to find a way of associating with with key mentors and with people who support you and your ideas and your work, and who give you the space to do 2 things: to make mistakes, but also to flourish. And if you don't have that, then it's almost impossible to succeed, whether you're in the legal field or whether you're in the public health field. And the way in which the patriarchy or the misogyny or the exclusion also happened in those spaces is highly political. And one of the things you have to find is the resilience to deal with both the internal and external factors, but also the way in which misogyny plays out in political spaces. In our engagements with government, in our engagements with the CEOs of pharmaceutical companies, in our engagements with regulatory bodies, this would always be sort of the determining feature, both race and obviously gender. And when you're a Black woman in those kind of spaces, you're obviously experiencing it in a way which is more profound. And I think in a way which is more triggering, right? Because you grow up in a society that already tells you that you're 2nd class or you're 3rd class and you don't matter. And in your professional career, despite all your qualifications, or for example, I graduated in the top 5% of my class in law school, but the response of people who are the key gatekeepers doesn't recognize that, right? They would if you were a white man, for example, in South Africa, but not if you were a brown or a Black woman. And one of the really toxic ways in which that played out in that period of 10 years was just sort of the HIV/AIDS denialism that we had to deal with. So you navigating a space of being a young lawyer, of being a young woman lawyer, of being a young brown woman lawyer, and in South Africa, because of apartheid, the way in which we deal with identity is very different to the way people, for example, deal with it in the UK or in the US. So you regard yourself as a black African woman. And one of the things is trying to continuously assert your right to have a presence in shaping a strategy on access to healthcare services or access to ARVs, for example. But similarly, trying to just make yourself be relevant, right? And dealing with the HIV/AIDS denialism, dealing with the issue of patriarchy and racism in this particular space. And then obviously, if you're a younger woman, you've got to deal with the issue of, well, you don't know enough. People who are much older than you are going to basically tell you that they have all the answers, even if you may work really hard to be able to say, well, I have a different view of considering a set of issues. So that, coupled with dealing with a deadly denialism of the Mbeki administration at the time and a health minister at the time who didn't believe that HIV caused AIDS, was, I think, a double burden of having to navigate that space while our colleagues and our friends and people were dying because they weren't able to access healthcare services. So in a way, the way in which race and gender inequality played out under apartheid very soon started playing out in the response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And what made it worse was basically the government's initial response to the HIV/AIDS crisis as being something that only affected gay men. So there was another element to how we had to incorporate issues around sexual orientation, around race, around sex, and use health data and research to try and make that argument around how do we improve access to healthcare services for people living with HIV and their civil and political rights, but also how do we deal with government's own denialism. We were one of the countries where our government refused to believe that HIV caused AIDS and refused to basically make life-saving medicines available to people living with HIV, while also dealing with a pharmaceutical industry that at that time was very male-dominated, very patriarchal too, and to force them and to convince them to basically make those medicines available to people in the global south. And so if we fast forward, some of that time of great suffering and I think great death as well, and we can talk about the issue of burnout as well, and how do you protect yourself? How do you make yourself more resilient when you're dealing with epidemics and pandemics? And I think this pandemic is one example of that. Is that the work that we did, and it's very hard to talk about like yourself individually because during the anti-apartheid movement, during the HIV/AIDS global access to medicines movement, you always talk about a collective, right? It's never about just one person. But because of that work, when there was a change in government, President Mbeki was recalled and the denialist minister was basically replaced with a different person. I was asked to leave my job at the AIDS Project within 48 hours and then become a special advisor to the Minister of Health in government. And I mean, I haven't really spoken about this before, but if you think that civil society or the academic community has to deal with levels and levels of patriarchy and misogyny and blatant sexism, my experience in government basically was so negative and was so bizarre because it was so obvious, not just within our own government, but within the multilateral institutions or health bodies that we had to meet, within foreign missions or foreign governments. And so basically, when people talk about a man's world, or a really patriarchal environment to work in. I think my time in government working in the health department and then later in public enterprises was, the best illustration of how difficult it is for women to become leaders within their own political circles and within government departments. It's definitely not easy. So to become a woman minister of health, which the minister I was working for was Barbara Hogan, who was a former political prisoner and then also became a mentor to me. The experiences of women ministers of health and male ministers of health was so different within that particular political environment, and her having a woman special advisor to her even though I came from an activist world, also presented different challenges. And so, that was quite an interesting experience. But once she was basically, and it's a political complicated situation where the current, the former president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, who's now been imprisoned based on a contempt of court case, was basically the president at the time, and he removed her from cabinet because one of the things we did was to stand up to state capture. And so, the experience of speaking out against corruption or speaking out against state capture is something that, one day I'll write about. But that experience led us, or led me to learn about how, when you're in a position of authority and you have to make decisions that don't comply with the best interests of the largest numbers of people in your country, that can lead to either political isolation or academic isolation. So you can use it in whatever context you want. The act of speaking out and the act of doing the right thing has such great consequences, particularly, I think, for women in this particular space, that it's not easy. And I think that requires a lot of strength and a lot of resilience. And, shortly after I'd served my time as a special advisor to the minister and learned how government actually operates and works. And I think if you want to be in global health in that particular space, you actually need to understand how government health departments work. You need to understand how the WHO works. You need to understand how the CDC works. You need to understand how UNICEF works. And the levels of politics, politicization, and dealing then on the side with elements of misogyny, racism, patriarchy, and a lot of it is subliminal, right? A lot of it is not obvious and it's not in your face. So in order to navigate those spaces, you actually have to experience that, and you have to learn how to resist, I think, becoming part of the problem and also becoming part of that particular captured class. So shortly after leaving government, basically what I did was started a number of organizations, eventually became a donor and a philanthropist working at the Open Society Foundation for South Africa to support a number of civil society organizations working in the social justice space. And when the COVID pandemic hit, basically, I was on my sabbatical after having done 6 years of philanthropy, which has its own challenges if you're a woman in a position of leadership. And that's when I, basically got full circle to how do we respond to this pandemic with the lens of social justice and health justice. And basically that's, how the Health Justice Initiative was born, which only started in July of 2020. And the focus has really been on trying to build a team that is made up of women, that tries to advance young women in this particular space while still focusing on really life and death issues around vaccine access and vaccine justice, in the global south, and then obviously in South Africa. Some of the lessons I've learned is that nobody prepares you for a leadership position. You get asked, you get put into that particular position in the deep end. So one of the things I would have done differently, if I had that chance again, was to have actually not just learned about law and not just learned about health and epidemiology and about ARVs, but also to learn about leadership. And how do you lead with compassion? How do you lead with kindness? How do you lead as a woman in a country that has always been beset by issues of patriarchy, racism, and misogyny? The second important thing is mentorship, which I've talked about before. All the mentors in my life have always been women. I think that is so significant and important. But women of different ages, and in my country, obviously, women of different races, and women who come with different knowledge sets. And I think that that idea of having a support system, particularly when you're in a position of leadership, is so critical, and people often underestimate that. And then finally, I mean, you know, it's very hard to find a South African woman who speaks about the experience without talking about politics. Everything that we do, everything that we grew up with, everything that we will do for the next 20, 30 years in whatever work we do is highly politicized and highly political. And so ideology becomes a really important factor in how you do your work, in what kind of work that you do, when you step back from a particular set of work, or when you actually speak up, or when you decide to become a whistleblower, for example, because politics are so ingrained in the way in which we were brought up and in the way in which we do all of our work. And so that leads me to the thing about, I started out as a lawyer, and yes, people call me, you know, a human rights lawyer, but we all became activists first. And it's something that we've always said, that you know, your professional career is second, your social justice activism is first, and it applies outside of the 9-to-5 setting, right? It's not just when you're working and you're doing your work. Your activism or your social justice kind of that catalyst for why you do what you do in your professional life actually comes from somewhere which is deeply personal and deeply profound. And that is something that has to carry through to your work. Don't ever let anybody tell you that that should be kept separate, or you should, you know, compartmentalize it, because I think some of the best work we've done has actually come from that deep place of activism, where you really want to change the way in which the system works. You recognize all the problems, you recognize the roadblocks, you recognize the obstacles, but you still pursue a particular project because that's going to have the greatest impact on the most amount of people that is possible. There's a fascinating interview that has just been released today about the new director of UNAIDS, Winnie, her experience about being a Black woman in a position of global leadership. It's a similar experience, I imagine, to the new DG of the World Trade Organization, who's also from Africa. And Winnie talks about this concept of blending in, where in order to be accepted in international health circles or in international NGOs or whatever the work that we do as African women, that there's this expectation that you have to blend in. And one of the calls is, you know, definitely don't do that, right? You've got to set yourself apart from all of your colleagues. You can obviously do that in a very cohesive way and in a very supportive way. But if we don't appreciate that the women we are working with and the women we are partnering with all come from very different backgrounds, where they are told to behave in a certain way, where they are told how much value they have, where they are told what they can and can't do, then you can't be that supportive woman to other women. And it's the issue around how do you protect the women in your space? How do you work with the women in your space? And mostly, and you know, this will be my last point, we can open up to Q&A, is, and I haven't talked about how sexism plays out, obviously, in the workplace, right? Or in any of your other engagements with any multilateral bodies, and that is sexual harassment. So as women in these places, we've all been subjected to this. We all experience it. And the issue is, how do you take the gains of the Me Too movement, of the Black Lives Matter movement, and how do you create and work towards the space where you support as many colleagues and as many women as possible? One, to give them opportunities, which is the obvious thing, but two, to support them in whatever journey they have to go through, to do two things: to call out the abuse or harassment or sexual harassment or bullying, particularly in the workplace, and particularly, I think, in different health spaces. And then two, to support them in whatever choice they make in order to challenge that kind of abuse of power. And it's an issue I've spoken to many of my male colleagues about. This is the one issue they seldom have to deal with, whether they're studying or whether they're working in any of these particular institutions or in local NGOs or in local or global contexts. And it's something that whether, as women, we just have to confront and we have to challenge. But the issue is, how do you do that with the most amount of solidarity? And I mean, I've certainly in my past have had colleagues who've had to lodge complaints about leaders at international health bodies. I mean, you'll remember the crisis a few years ago at UNAIDS. And so when you're doing this work, it's not just about the solidarity on a particular issue related to access to medicines or HIV or TB or COVID. It also relates to your role as a woman in this particular space to provide the solidarity to other women leaders who are experiencing the misogyny in very different ways to maybe the way you are experiencing it. So, Anna, I don't know, perhaps I should stop there and then we can take some Q&A, because I feel like there's so many stories to tell, but I don't know if I've done it justice, because I'm trying to cram 49 years into like 15 minutes.
Well, we've got some great questions queued up. And one thing that really resonates, we've been doing this series for almost a year now. And there are key lessons that I think we're just seeing really come home, right? The importance of mentorship and people to create spaces where you can make mistakes and flourish, right? This idea of having freedom to fail. So at some point I might circle back and ask you about, having those spaces, that freedom, and what that looks like, particularly as a woman. You talked about the patriarchy being highly political and really showing up in all of the spaces that you worked. And then I really love this point that nobody prepared you for a leadership position, right? You get asked, you get put in, but this is a key area of growth, right? How do you learn about leadership, leading as a woman, leading with compassion and kindness? These are two things that you raised. But I'd like to get to some questions that our audience asked. So Lindsay said, how has misogyny and patriarchy transformed throughout your career? In your experience, is it still ubiquitous in most organizations or only within specific sectors? And then do you think that misogyny has increased or decreased any or changed in its nature throughout your career?
Okay, thanks. So let me take that. So, it's a really good question, because it's quite tricky. One would think that it's changed and that it's actually lessened because of the Me Too movement and because of BLM and because we just have a lot more media that is interested in telling these stories and that are not scared of telling these stories, and we have really a lot of women who are really brave to tell their story. So in some respects, I think that what has happened is that people are more embarrassed to be openly misogynistic. So what may seem like less misogyny is actually just a very creative, clever way of hiding it, right? But the misogyny still exists, and it's still there, and it plays out in different ways. And I think the issue of implicit bias, you'll have a lot of leaders who'll tell you, no, I'm not a misogynist, but I just don't think that you as a woman should be saying that or doing this, right? So I think I hate to say this, but I think there's levels of misogyny, and people are very clever at hiding that. But having said that, I do think that the Me Too movement has forced a reckoning of a lot of these organizations and institutions where men do realize that they have to call out their colleagues, that there has to be, the most simplest form is less mansplaining, right? So I can't, I've been doing this work for 25 years. I have an LLM from Duke University. I understand global health issues, and I get lectured all the time by men on vaccine justice. And I want to say to them, like, listen, dude, I've been doing this for 25 years. I know what I'm talking about. This is exactly, what's going to happen. And so I think it's also, as you grow older, you have more confidence to call out what I call the bullshit, right? You have to call out the misogyny, and you have to say, excuse me, what are you saying? What are you doing? Why are you saying that? So I think also there's different strategies, right, needed at different times, depending on where the misogyny resides, how severe it is it bordering into harassment? Is it just a very kind of a misogyny, which is basically, I don't want to support you with writing your article, or I don't want to support you with doing a case, to something more, even more, obvious, like, well, I don't think that you should be the leader of the UNAIDS or WTO. I mean, the fact that in 2021, we're celebrating the first woman leader of the WTO who comes from Africa, like, yes, we're very proud, but on the other hand, it's really embarrassing, right? So what have we been doing also as a movement of women for the last 25, 30 years, that we're getting a trickle of gains, and then we get really excited about it. So the long and short of it, I think, is that in some places it's actually worsened, and in some places it's lessened. For different reasons, and some of it is very self-motivated reasons, or reasons that people only they understand. But I think that as you do get older, you do have more confidence to be able to call it out. And I really wish that 26-year-old me knew that it was okay to call it out. Like, I really wish that somebody had told me, actually, that is wrong, that behavior is wrong, that conduct is wrong, that response is wrong. You can challenge that, say something. Because I think there's also people who, unless they are called out, they don't realize it. It's also the way in which maybe they grew up, or what they've been taught, or what they've been fed. So I do think there's value in calling something out. And I think there's value in checking with somebody else your own assumptions, so that you don't also become subject to the implicit bias kind of conundrum.
Yeah, I think that for young women, it's also a fear, likely, right, of losing their position, or just not having that same status to be able to call it out. There's a related question from Mana, who asks how you recommend to address this implicit bias that might happen during meetings where credentials or like evidence-based preparedness of a female leader matters, but like a male speaks after her, quickly dismisses her, right? I think we see this happen quite a bit.
Yeah, so I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been called the angry woman, right? Or the difficult woman, but I think we have to start wearing those badges proudly. I think we have to be the ones that call it out. I've had the benefit of a coach. I really think that coaching is underrated, and it really does have, value to have somebody to guide you into how to professionally navigate those spaces. And there's a way in which you can do it. I'm not a very calm person, but I've been taught the tactics and the strategies that when you're faced, with 12 different people, and at least 6 of them are definitely have an implicit bias and are trying to basically water down what you're saying, or not give you the space, or not give you the voice. And usually there's a race and gender kind of element to that, right? That this is how you deal with that. And this is why I say that one of the things, we may have PhDs, we may have doctorates, we may have masters, but nobody teaches us how to be a leader, and how to have those difficult conversations, and how to challenge them in a way which, it goes back to like what feminism is also all about, right? What is feminist leadership? So how do you raise those questions? How do you record them? I mean, I'm a lawyer, so my thing is I record everything in an email so that I have a record. And, small things like that are so important. But I also, I totally appreciate and understand it's so difficult. I mean, I don't want to be naive or want to be seen to be naive to suggest that, of course, all of you must just call out everything. It's difficult. I mean, we don't do it in our own communities. We don't do it in our own families, right? So we're not necessarily going to start doing it in the workplace or in an academic meeting or, at our university. And I think it's a journey. But I do think mentorship and remembering you're not imagining stuff, I think is probably the most important thing.
We've had 2 people ask how and in what ways can men be allies in women's leadership journeys?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, when I was appointed the director of Open Society Foundation for South Africa, and there were male board members who were allies and who were supportive of my journey. And I think it's that thing about somebody having your back, and obviously male mentors and advisors on the side. But one of the things that I've benefited from particularly is in the HIV/AIDS access to medicine movement. Some of the best comrades and allyships we had were actually from men in that particular community, who also ironically came from the global north, right, and the global south. And so I think it's a combination of luck that you actually encounter those men in your life. But I also think that you have to seek them out. I think it's very easy to figure out when you walk into a room of a few people who's going to be your ally or not. But they have been critical to my journey of, becoming a leader in different spaces. They've been critical to the reason why, I can actually manage the health justice initiative in the way in which that I want to do it. But they all appreciate and understand that they have to be on the side and they have to take a back seat and provide you with the support when you need it, but basically not try and control, I think, your space, and also not be, for want of a better word, paternalistic. So, I think that it's important to have male allyship, but trying to convince somebody about what you inherently believe in is not necessarily the best use of your time. And that could be I wish I could tell myself at 26, you cannot change people, you cannot change their ideas, and it's also not your job. So, it's something that we say to people who ask us about racism. We're like, it's your duty to learn that, and it's your duty to read. I am not going to be the person who explains to you what privilege is, right? You have to learn that as well for yourself. So, that would be my answer.
And what advice would you have for women in dealing with sexual harassment in the workplace, repercussions of calling out this behavior, and even being able to move forward in your career despite these different difficulties?
Yeah, I mean, we've had a few cases in the last few years in South Africa where sexual harassment against people who were considered leaders in civil society was basically, the whistle was blown, and really, again, flowing from the Me Too movement. And it hasn't been easy. And the support that we were able to provide so I was a donor at that time, and this was being experienced by our grantees in civil society, right? Was to offer as much support as you can without kind of forcing anybody to take a particular approach. And what I found was that there were some people who had the strength to basically go public and speak out, but it took years for them to do that. And some who still prefer up until this day not to do that, but would be comfortable with speaking to somebody in a confidential, protected space. I think the greatest fear women have about reporting sexual harassment is that their identity will be disclosed and that everybody will know, and that somehow it's their fault when it isn't, and that they won't have the necessary support structures, that the employer will see them as the difficult person in the organization, and that they'll be asked to leave. And I mean, I come from a country where the unemployment levels are so high that most women are so scared to speak out because of the economic cost of actually speaking out. So how do we create the spaces and movements to, one, protect each other, but two, provide a safe space for whatever choice you make? So if Anna decides to speak or not to speak, it doesn't matter. I've got to provide her with the space to just make her feel more protected, or whatever kind of support you may need. But I don't think any one of us have the playbook on, what advice you can give and what advice you can, what you should do or what you shouldn't do. I think that everybody goes through their own journey. They all have their own triggers. I think having somebody to speak to about that, though, and always remembering that you're not making it up, you're not imagining things, I think is probably the most important lesson. The stuff that, happened in my spaces when I was 24 and 25, and I thought, I must be imagining. I'm sure he didn't say that. I'm sure he didn't do that, right? Now, when I, in retrospect, look at it, I'm like, oh my God, that's a person who should have been fired, right? But you don't have, you're operating in a time of imperfect knowledge and anxiety, because if you're the person who's subject to harassment at that particular moment. And so I think the other lesson that we've learned with the entire movement to try and get people to actually speak out about abuse is that if you finally feel you have a story to tell 10 years later, 15, 20, 25 years later, tell it, if you have the necessary support there. A critical thing, I think, for workplaces, if you're ever going to be a woman in a position of leadership or supporting another woman in a position of leadership, is make sure that you have, it may seem unimportant, but it's one of the key things to getting women to be comfortable to speak out, is having a workplace harassment policy in place with very clear guidelines on who to call, how to report, when, that is what women want to know, so that they become familiar with a process by which they will be treated fairly and by which they're able to disclose. And having a system of confidential disclosures is so important, because, if you tell me I was going to report this to the dean, no, I'm not doing it, right? But if you say there is an offsite ombudsman who can be contacted by phone or by email, you don't have to go see this person physically. You're giving me options where I feel more comfortable to report abuse or harassment, or even, in worst case scenario, sexual violence. I want a system in which I feel totally comfortable, because I'm not going to, many women don't feel comfortable with the police, right, either. Particularly, unfortunately, in university settings, it's almost like it's like its own world with its own set of rules. It's worse than even the UN. So, these places are hard, they're not easy. And the amazing thing, however, has just been that despite all of these obstacles and odds, what I've just experienced in the last 25 years of doing this work is like really, really formidable, resilient women who are doing fantastic work, who can do fantastic work, while also juggling, the realities of living in a world where often it's not even, safe for women to walk to their car at night, right? Depending on where you live and where you work. So
yeah, I think that's a great point that you raise about having a policy within the organization. The data speaks to that is such a critical part of women coming forward. And the other thing that also really resonates is respecting people's choices. As we talk about empowerment in this space, I think a lot of us, you want empowerment to be like, all right, I empower you to make the decisions I would make, right? But that's not what empowerment is. It's about agency and creating space for people to make the decisions that are best for them within the structures that they have. Let's see, I want to ask this question as well. So you in the last question, you talked about it not being your responsibility really to teach people. And so one of our attendees asked how you balance expectations of teaching by allies, whether this is on gender or race, right? Knowing that there are requests or expectations that you might teach, that you might serve as a teacher, but you're saying it's their responsibility to learn.
Yes. No, just let me clarify. I'm saying to the men in my space, you need to learn how to be a better feminist, and you need to go learn that. I'm not going to teach you. I will give up my weekends and every free time I have to mentor and support any other woman. That's like not even a question. And one of the privileges of my life has been able to do that, to mentor a younger generation of young women leaders. But when you have men in positions of power who are highly privileged, who expect women to teach them how to be better allies, then my response to them is, you have to go learn this yourself. It's not my duty to teach you. The thing about time and energy is that it's so limited and so valuable that you also, every day you have to sit with a book, right, and a pen, and figure out what is the most important thing for me to do right now. Where are my skills most needed? Where is my energy most needed? I mean, a lot of us are also juggling family, you're juggling community, you're juggling expectations, particularly if you come from, communities where there's a lot of intergenerational expectations, right? So we're not just dealing with the workplace. So I think it was in that context that I was talking about, expectations on you to teach others. And it's the same conversation we have with feminists in the global north, right? Where we say to them, but I don't need, why am I having to teach you how you're supposed to treat me in the global south as an academic or as a fellow activist or as a fellow, health ally? You need to figure this out for yourself. This is not how you treat people who are not English speaking, or, how do you create the space which is totally inclusive, which is totally supportive, because there often is a divide between the privilege of the North and the privilege of the South, right? So, I mean, I grew up under apartheid as a middle income or working class family, for example, but I'm still more privileged than many other women in my society in South Africa, right? But maybe compared to my colleague in Canada or, a colleague in, I don't know, Latin America, all of our experiences are so different. And it's the thing about, when you're figuring out allyship is who are you? Who are you working with, right? But the common denominator is that I think almost every single person here on this group has probably experienced misogyny, sexism, racism, patriarchy, or even harassment. And so there is something, I think, that binds us as women, no matter where we come from, no matter, what our geographies or class or whatever. And that has to be something that we use to actually create more support for each other.
Something that you said, you're talking about time, right? Time being so valuable. And particularly in this space around like stepping up and educating people or supporting efforts around diversity and inclusivity. I mean, one thing we find is that it's often women who are asked to do this work, right? To do the inclusivity, diversity, anti-racism work, or it's women who step up to do it, and which is largely volunteer. And so I think this is, for me, it's just an interesting point about having time, valuing time, particularly the time of women and what it is that we ask people to do. So I thought that was a really great point. I want to bring you back to mentorship for a moment. Now, I have a lot of feelings around mentorship, which is largely that it's luck, right? You said that finding male mentors is luck, but I think mentorship in general is luck. I think it's just like the same luck as finding a partner, right? Or finding really great friends. It's hard. You have to match, you have to date around, right? You have to see. But we have a participant who asks your suggestions as a woman interested in global health. How do you find or even select or mentor? Right? What do you see as some of the processes that have either worked, or is it all luck and putting yourself out there?
So great question. I think it's definitely luck is whether the mentorship will work, right? And sometimes people come into your life just by pure coincidence. But I think you also need to have a deliberate strategy. So you know that you want to specialize in, I don't know, let's just take TB as an example. You've got to do your research And you've got to find out who is that 1 or 2 people globally in the world that is doing the work that resonates the most with your work. They don't have to be in the health space, right? Some of my mentors have not been from the legal or health fields. They've been from other fields, but they understand what you're trying to do. So you've got to do the research. You've got to figure out, in an ideal world, who would be my supporter, who would be my mentor, and you've got to reach out to them. But obviously, you're not going to reach out to them directly. You're going to find out who do they know that knows somebody else. And we're living in a time of social media. So I, for example, get DM'd all the time on Twitter. This is how, for example, I meet lots of people who'll be like, I really like what you said. I'd like to learn about this. Etc. Or I know Anna, and Anna gave me your email, and so I know that this person is coming from a good place because I trust Anna. So it's networks, it's social media. LinkedIn is so useful and so important. And I think it's remembering that on the receiving end, women actually get really, I think, honored to be asked by somebody. So don't feel like, you're imposing on somebody, or who are you to ask somebody else? I mean, try it. The world is full of people. I mean, maybe, you'll get a few no's, but you're definitely going to get a few yeses. So you have to be very strategic about what is it do you want in 5 years' time? Where do you want to be? What are the type of mentors do you need to be able to get you to that point? Go find them. And then make a plan, basically, be very proactive, because they're not going to fall into your lap. It's very rare that an amazing mentor just, falls into your lap. And yeah, use your academic university networks, use the social media networks, and ask a lot of questions. I mean, obviously not everybody's going to get Winnie Benyama to be their mentor, right? I mean, she's running UNA, she's busy. But here's the interesting thing. Winnie has mentors. Winnie has advisors. So no matter what position you are, no matter how advanced you are in your leadership journey, I think the important thing is that you have to recognize and accept that you will always need help, and you'll always need support, and get the help and support from people who actually have your back. And the second lesson of that is cut out people that do not help or support you. So I may think Anna's going to be a great mentor. After the first 2 times with her, she's just negative. She's telling me I can't do things. She's being really conservative and cautious. Cancel. Move on to another mentor. You don't have to stay in anything that doesn't advance, and you must be selfish about this, doesn't advance your career, doesn't advance your journey as a woman leader, or as a woman thinker, or as a woman writer. And you always have to remember the same that we say about family or friends or men or partnerships. Similarly, in our own spaces, if somebody is going to make you feel less than you really are, then it's time to cut that, right?
Yeah. One of my mentors who's on the call today says it always has to be a win-win, right? A win for you and a win for the mentor. So, you have to think about it. And, you're right. I love getting contacted on LinkedIn. I've met plenty of people, made lots of connections there. But it always has to be that win-win. So I really like it when people reach out to me, but they're specific, right? As you said, I like this thing that you said, it really resonates with me. I'd love to talk and chat. And sometimes it's a one-time connection, but sometimes it's a much longer relationship. But it always has to be that win-win, both for you and for the mentor. We're at the top of the hour, but I want to ask one question if you're willing to stick with me for just another minute. And this is really about your vision for the future. So what do you think men and women from diverse professionals need to move forward and to work together and promote leadership for women?
So, I mean, the first thing that's like my absolute bugbear is if any university or institution or NGO decides to have a mentor, right? Particularly in a time of COVID, that's like my vision is that we never ever have a men-only panel or a only male senior leadership of some of the key institutions in the country. And I think that there are some really significant moves at the WHO level, at UN level, to try and actually deal with this issue of representation, right? But we've got to push that ourselves. So if we are going to have a conversation on, I don't know, say, cancer treatment, it's also about using the networks to find the women who speak to different experiences from different parts of the world and start actually practicing that particular approach of how we tell our story and how we do our work, right? So the vision has to be one of inclusion, one of acceptance, one of adequate representation of voices from the global south, of voices from the global north, and the voices of women who have different experiences. One of the greatest limitations to, I think, a lot of our work is that we don't often include enough people from different social classes. And so we're losing out on the stories and experience and reflections of people who may not have the resources that we do. And so we don't get to hear from them. How would we have male allies supporting us? I think, the vision has to obviously be one where you have it's free from harassment and free from misogyny, but it's also where men implicitly acknowledge and understand that they've actually been in many respects in our way, and that they've got to step aside to allow more women to become the leaders that they truly are, but with the necessary support. The worst thing that can happen is you get asked to run an organization after a man has been running it for 10 years, and he doesn't transfer any of the skills or any of the leadership know-how to you, right? And similarly, if a woman does that to you. So the issue of the transfer of skills, mentorship, sharing of experience, I think is so critical. Never, ever accept a position of leadership unless you ask the 10 questions. Will I get a coach? Who will support me? What is, how are we going to deal with mistakes? Because obviously you're going to make mistakes in the first 2 years. I mean, you've never run an organization in your life before. It's like, telling somebody to drive a car on the first day. So I think it's having that confidence to say, I don't know, I would like answers, and I would like to ask the following questions, which I think is really critical. So I don't know if I've answered your question totally, but yeah, those are some of the ideas I have.
No, this is great. Thank you so much. Okay, we've gone over. Fatima, thank you for spending time with us today. Everyone, this is a monthly series we took off for the month of June, but we should be back next month and moving forward. So stick with us, join our Slack network. Megan has also posted an evaluation link, so please join or respond there with some feedback on today's session. And Fatima, again, thank you so much for spending the time and sharing your leadership journey and lessons learned with us today. It was a real pleasure.
No, it was absolutely my pleasure. And yeah, I hope I did your topic justice. So Brilliant. Thanks for the opportunity.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. All right. Bye, everyone.